Depth of field can add a lot to your scenes. So I figured we would take a look at how depth of field works inside Houdini using Octane. Camera settings seem to work a little bit different inside Houdini versus other programs, so that's why I figured we would take a look at that today. I just have a quick, simple scene set up here. If you want to learn how to use for each loops and random rotations and scales, I do have other videos on that. But that's really not important because that's not the focus of the video. Just wanted to get some objects in here so that we could illustrate the depth of field. Jumping out of there, I just have this Octane quick setup, which is a node that's all sorts of cool things going on. It's basically just Octane setup. You can get it. I'll try to leave the link in the description on where to get it. It is free if you're using Octane. It's definitely something I would recommend getting to, or if you're going to use Octane in Houdini. And then I just have a camera in here, so you can just drop in a normal camera and that you would have inside of Houdini up here, and you should be all good. And this Spectron light is not actually being used for the scene, so I can actually just go ahead and delete it. I was using that to set up the noises that you'll see here in a second. So let's go ahead and pull up the Octane IPR. So if you don't know how to do that, just once you have your Octane installed into Houdini, you can add it to the shelf up here and then just click the IPR. And let's go ahead and switch scenes here. So now you can see on the right side of my screen over here, we have our IPR set up. So this scene already has set up for the depth of field. Let's go ahead and take a look at how the camera settings work here inside Houdini. So looking here, the three main settings that are going to affect your depth of field, they work a lot like an actual camera. So if you ever use an actual camera to take, like a DSLR to take pictures, it's going to be very similar in that regard. So you have your focal length, your aperture, and then if I jump over to the sampling here, we have our f-stop. And you can also change the type of depth of field that you have here. So you can do box filters or radial, or you can disable all bokeh in general. Oops, let's go ahead and set that back to radial. So your f-stop is going to affect it just a little bit here. I'll go ahead, let's drag this up. The lower it is, the more depth of field that you're gonna have. So as I drag this up, you can see that the kind of blurriness kind of goes away. If I set this super high, there's basically no depth of field going on here. But if I bring this all the way back down, you can see that we start to have some depth of field. But that also works in conjunction with our focal length here. So Houdini, you have to crank these up pretty high in my experience here to get any sort of good depth of field going, unless your objects are super, super far away from each other. But these settings are pretty good for this scale of scene. So you can see we basically have -15 to 15, and same with the X and Z axis. So it's not a super big scene, but it is pretty high values here, especially for your focal length and aperture. So by default, if I go ahead and control click with my middle mouse button, bring these back to their default values, you can see that our depth of field has basically disappeared. Even with this f-stop being super low, doesn't really change anything as I drag this up or down. And that's because our focal length and our aperture aren't set right. If I go ahead and drag up our aperture, you're going to see what this does. So it kind of zooms the image farther away, or if you lower it, it's going to zoom into the image. It's just kind of opening up the aperture, or how much light is being let into your camera. But the focal length here, so you've probably seen, if you have worked with cameras at all, you got a 55 millimeter, or like a 75 millimeter, or maybe even a 35 for like portraits. Those are kind of some pretty common focal lengths, as well as like 300, I think, is for normal, like landscape photography. I don't mess around with cameras a whole lot, but I do have kind of a basic understanding of them. So as I crank up this focal length here, you can see that it's also going to zoom in, and as I lower it, it's going to zoom out. So if we combine that with our aperture here, you can see that we're going to be zooming in on our image. But you can see here that even if if you saw before, I had a 200 aperture setting and then a 400 focal length. So even if I set this to something like 20, and then as I lower this, you can see, or as I increase this, you see that we still don't have a lot of depth of field in here, even with this 1.4 f-stop. So if I have a 2-to-1 ratio like I had before, we're still not getting that depth of field that we had before in the last at the beginning of the video. So as you crank this up, like I said, you're going to probably need some pretty high values. You can see that as I lower this, we're getting quite a bit of depth of field here, and obviously we can change our focus distance. Let's go back to the 20 and the 10, and let's go ahead and change our focus distance. You can actually pick your focus just by clicking this little button right here, and then set your focus length to wherever. But you see that doesn't really affect anything with our image, just because we don't have a high enough focal length and a high enough aperture setting. So let's go ahead and set those back to 400 and 200. So that gives us some pretty good settings for this scene. And if I go ahead and change this focus distance, you're going to see kind of what happens. So as I bring this up, it's going to focus further away from our camera. If I bring it super far, it gets super blurry. If I bring this back down, obviously down to 0 is not going to be where we want it, but you see it's going to come into focus, go back out of focus. I'll bring it back into focus here in the middle of where we have our image. And then as I bring this lower, you're going to see that closer to the camera is going to be what's in focus. So if I set this to like maybe 20 is a little bit too much, 25, starting to get in focus right here to these closer objects. Bring it up to 30. You can see they're pretty much in focus now, and the stuff in the back is out of focus. So I bring this up to 50. Now the image is more in focus in the back, or towards the middle to the back, and it is blurry in the very front and the very, very far back. So kind of play around with these settings. If I go ahead and increase this, so if I set this to something like 600, it's going to really increase the depth of field that we have in our image here. So if I set that to like 400, you can see just how that affects our image. And I can continue to play with these settings and kind of bring stuff into focus and out of focus as I please. So basically, the way Houdini is, you're going to have to just bring up these settings quite a bit, quite higher than you probably will in pretty much any other application. I've used I used Octane a little bit while I was using Cinema 4D, and I don't ever remember having to crank these settings up this high. Maybe I'm wrong, but if I am, feel free to let me know. But mainly focus on your f-stop value here. And again, as I bring this up, you're going to see that it's going to bring stuff back into focus. So if you just want a little bit of depth of field going on, you can bring this up once you have all of your aperture and focal length settings dialed in. You can kind of bring stuff more further out of focus if you need to. If you leave that by default, I think it's at 5.6. Yep. You can see that there's not a whole lot of depth of field in there, just maybe a tiny little bit. And if you raise that, obviously it's going to get rid of it, like I said before. But play with that setting. If you want to change your bokeh, basically your the way it handles the depth of field, you can do that. You have an option for an image file. So if you've ever used those, you can do some cool stuff with those as well. Get some different looks with them. And then, like I said, focus on your focal length and your aperture to get the look that you're going for. But anyways, hopefully this helps you out for Octane inside of Houdini. I do plan on doing a bunch of other stuff on Octane. I'm going to be focusing on that and doing some more stuff with Redshift as well. So if you're interested at all in Octane or Redshift, specifically how they work inside of Houdini and what you can do with Houdini, because there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with the attributes inside of Houdini to do some cool stuff. Kind of done a couple things on that before, but there's a lot of stuff you can do inside of Houdini with the different render engines. So if you're interested in learning about that, make sure you subscribe. I also have a bunch of other videos on my channel that deal with Houdini, as well as some stuff on Clarice and Redshift and Cinema 4D as well. So if you're interested in any of that, feel free to check those out. But anyways, thank you guys for watching and have a good day.